right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty big.
Yeah.
The 2024 U.S. elections.
Big one.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, hold on a second. I live in Zimbabwe.
Right.
This doesn't really affect me.
Yeah, I can see why you'd think that. But we're gonna try and unpack.
It really does.
Yeah, it does.
And we're going to try and unpack all the different ways that the results of the U.S. election could have a real impact on Zimbabwe, even though it's thousands of miles away.
Yeah, and just to set the scene a little bit, the U.S. plays such a major role in global trade and diplomacy and international stability.
Right.
You know, the whole shebang,
It's
really.
a global superpower.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So decisions that are made in the U.S. can have a ripple effect across the entire world, including Zimbabwe.
Okay, so let's jump right into it with one of the biggest what-ifs, I guess.
Okay.
What if Trump wins
Right.
and brings back his America First policy?
Yeah.
I'm curious what that could mean for Zimbabwe.
Well, America First is all about prioritizing American businesses and interests, right? It's about putting America first.
Right.
So you can kind of see it from both sides.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it could actually mean less pressure on Zimbabwe to kind of conform to Western policies and ways of doing things.
I see.
But the trade-off there is that it could also mean less financial support from the U.S. in terms of aid and development.
Less pressure, but also potentially less help.
Exactly.
And we know Zimbabwe has faced some, economic challenges.
Yeah.
So what does this shift towards an America First policy actually mean for specific sectors in Zimbabwe? Like, I'm thinking of agriculture, which is obviously such a huge part of the Zimbabwean economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at something like tobacco, for example.
Right.
One of Zimbabwe's top agricultural exports, and a good chunk of that goes to the U.S.
Right.
Now imagine if the U.S. slapped on higher import taxes or tariffs, as they've done in the past.
Yeah.
Suddenly, Zimbabwean tobacco is more expensive in the U.S., which could really hurt farmers in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. It's a pretty big deal for them.
Absolutely.
And, on top of all that, there's also the whole issue of sanctions.
Oh, right.
Didn't Trump support sanctions on Zimbabwe before?
He did, yeah. And this is something that directly affects many Zimbabweans.
Right.
A Trump win could very well mean that those sanctions stay in place.
Right.
Which would restrict Zimbabwe's access to international finance.
Wow.
Make it harder for businesses to operate.
Yeah.
It's a real worry for people at home in Zimbabwe and also for the Zimbabwean diaspora, those living abroad, including a good number in the U.S. who rely on being able to send money back home.
It's incredible how these things are all so interconnected, isn't it?
Totally.
Like decisions made in Washington, D.C. can have a real tangible impact on the lives of everyday Zimbabweans.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
And speaking of connections, how might this election shake up global power dynamics, especially with countries like China?
Yeah, that's a crucial point you've hit on there. Trump has historically been quite tough on China, hasn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he's even gone so far as to call them a rival on the world stage.
Yeah.
So if he were to return to that stance, it could create a lot of tension and uncertainty globally.
Right.
And that could spill over and affect Zimbabwe, which has these, close economic ties with China.
So almost like Zimbabwe's caught in the middle
Potentially,
of this power struggle.
And it's not just the economic side of things either.
Right.
Think about peace and security.
Okay.
Under his previous administration, Trump actually reduced funding for security programs in Africa.
Right.
So what does that mean for Zimbabwe? Well, less U.S. support could weaken efforts to combat terrorism in the region,
Right.
which could directly impact stability in Zimbabwe and in its neighboring countries.
Right, because security in one country really affects the whole region.
For sure.
And speaking of challenges that, kind of affect everyone no matter where you live,
Yeah.
what about climate change? I mean, this is something that you can't really escape.
It's a global issue.
Yeah.
And this is where Trump's previous stance on climate change is particularly worrying for many in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, he pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, remember?
Right.
That's a big deal because Zimbabwe relies heavily on international support to help tackle the effects of climate change.
Right.
Things like droughts, floods,
Right.
which have a direct impact on its agriculture and energy sectors.
Right.
So less help from the U.S. could make it much harder for Zimbabwe to deal with these climate-related challenges.
Wow. So if we kind of take a step back and look at the big picture here, it sounds like a potential Trump presidency could bring a whole lot of uncertainty for Zimbabwe.
Yeah, there are definitely some potential challenges, but
Yeah.
it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay.
This situation could also push Zimbabwe to become more self-reliant.
Right.
Maybe it'll strengthen ties with other African countries, explore new trade partnerships, and become less dependent on Western aid. It could actually be a catalyst for innovation and economic growth in the long run.
Right. So it's almost like it's a push to forge their own path.
Exactly.
It's not just about the challenges, but also the potential opportunities that might come with navigating this new global landscape.
You've hit the nail on the head.
So really, this election could act as a turning point for Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
It's a question of, will it lead to greater resilience and independence, or will it expose existing vulnerabilities?
Food for thought.
Something to think about.
Indeed.
All right, well, that wraps up our deep dive into the 2024 U.S. elections and their potential impact on Zimbabwe.
Fascinating stuff.
Until next time.
See you then.